Good morning. Good to see you. Those of you who know me will know that I'm not particularly strong with technology. I describe myself as a tech toddler. So it's been an interesting few weeks for me getting to learn a lot more than I've ever known about YouTube, for example. Managing a YouTube channel allows you to look at what YouTube calls your analytics. So, for example, I can see how many people come to our worship services. I suppose that's no different than being there on a Sunday morning in the building. I can see what time you come at. I can see who comes in their pajamas. No, I can't see that. Don't worry. Anyway, it's good to see you. So we've been studying Mark's Gospel, and although this morning's Palm Sunday, the point that we're at in Mark's Gospel is actually a little bit further on in the story. We're well into chapter 15. If you haven't already got one, grab a Bible. It'll help you to follow me as I speak here just now. Last week we were with Jesus at his trial, and we saw how the perfect judge allowed corrupt human judges to pass a judgment on him. Their verdict? Guilty. The sentence they passed? Death by crucifixion. We saw how Jesus Christ, the one perfect person who's ever lived, died in our place, in yours and mine and all the sinful people who've ever lived. In Jesus, God chose to die in our place. This week, as we continue to read on in Mark's account, we'll move with Jesus from his trial to his death. First of all, some soldiers have fun with him. We read about that in verses 16 to 20 of Mark 15. They mock him. But we're going to pick up the story in verse 20. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he didn't take it, and they crucified him. They crucified him. Crucifixion was designed to be the most agonizing and humiliating method of execution. The Romans reserved it for the worst possible offences, crimes against the empire. They'd take you to a public place. If they were doing it today in East Belfast, I think they'd do it down at C.S. Lewis Square, or they'd do it at the Knock traffic lights. They'd nail you by hands and feet to a rough wooden cross. It was a slow, bloody spectacle. It was agonizing, and it usually ended in a horrible death by shock or asphyxiation, by suffocation. I've heard sermons where the preacher's chosen to dwell on what we might call the gory details, but Mark doesn't. He doesn't really say very much about Jesus' suffering. He doesn't focus so much on the details of Jesus' death as on the meaning of it. He's less interested in the how and more interested in the why of Jesus' death. Let's see what we can learn from Mark about the meaning of Jesus' death. Let's pick up the story again in verse 25. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads, saying, "So, you who were going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. Did you pick that up? Darkness for 3 hours in the middle of the day. People have offered all sorts of explanations for this darkness. Some say it was an eclipse. But a solar eclipse doesn't create absolute darkness for more than a few seconds. A solar eclipse can't happen during the time of a full moon. And we know that the Passover is always celebrated at full moon. This darkness doesn't seem to have been a run-of-the-mill solar eclipse. Some folks have suggested that the darkness was caused by a sandstorm. In the desert, if there's a strong enough windstorm, it can throw up dust and sand, enough to obscure the sun for days on end. But the Passover falls in wet season in Israel. So this darkness couldn't have come from a sandstorm. Remember what we said about Mark's account of Jesus' crucifixion? He's less interested in the how and more interested in the why. Well, it's the same here when he describes the darkness. Mark doesn't bother to tell us how the darkness came about, but he wants us to consider why there's a darkness. What does this darkness mean? Think about it for a second. What does darkness usually mean? When you're watching a movie and the director wants to tell us that all's not well, then he or she will resort to filming in low light. Whether the action's actually taking place at night time or not, there's often a way of using dark to show that something's gone wrong or is about to go wrong. We have learned over the years that when it gets dark, something's wrong. God's people Israel knew the same thing. They had been trained to understand that darkness in the daytime is a sign that something's wrong. They had been trained to understand this not by Hollywood, but by God's word, the Bible. You see, in the Bible, darkness in the daytime is recognized as a sign of God's anger and his judgment. So, for example, whenever God's angry with Pharaoh and Egypt, the penultimate plague is a plague of darkness. Whenever darkness falls, we know that God is acting in judgment. That begs a question, doesn't it? If darkness falls at just the moment when Jesus Christ is crucified, God must be acting in judgment. But who is God judging? God's judging his only Son, whom he loves. He's judging Jesus, the only perfect person who ever lived. That seems weird, doesn't it? It doesn't seem fair. Why would a loving Father judge his perfect Son? Remember what we said last week when we thought about Barabbas? Jesus Christ chose to go to the cross. He chose to face the judgment that was rightfully ours. He chose to die in your place and in mine, and in the place of every sinful person who ever has lived. Now, in the dark, Jesus is going down under God's judgment so that we can live beyond the judgment of God. Before we come to think more about that, watch this video to help you remember that Jesus has power over darkness.